Something feels different about you, and you know it. Not in a dramatic way, there's no single moment you can point to. It's quieter than that. You wake up already tired even after resting. Simple choices take more effort. Conversations feel slightly off, like you're speaking a language you no longer fully belong to. You sense that something has shifted, but you can't explain what it is. It's not sadness, it's not stress. It's more like your inner rhythm changed while the world kept the same pace, and the more you try to ignore it, the louder that feeling becomes. What if this isn't a problem to solve, but a signal to understand? What if this strange discomfort isn't pulling you apart, but calling you into a deeper version of yourself that's been waiting for you to notice? When you feel out of alignment, it's rarely because something is wrong with you. It's usually because something in you is trying to move, and the rest of your life hasn't caught up yet. Alignment isn't comfort, it's coherence. It's that quiet sense that what you think, what you feel, and what you do are pointing in roughly the same direction. When that coherence begins to shift, the first thing you notice is friction. Simple choices feel heavier. Conversations that once flowed now feel forced. You might catch yourself pulling back without knowing why, as if your inner world took one step forward while your outer world stayed where it was. This is often described as feeling off, but that word hides what's really happening. What's happening is a change in frequency, not in a mystical sense that floats above daily life, but in a very practical one. Your attention is reorganizing. Your tolerance for noise is lowering. Your system is asking for a different pace, a different input, a different quality of engagement. And because this shift doesn't announce itself clearly, the mind interprets it as a problem. One of the clearest signs of this change is a growing discomfort with things you used to accept without question. Certain jokes land wrong. Certain routines feel strangely hollow. You're not judging them, they just don't resonate anymore. This isn't about becoming better than anything or anyone. It's about no longer being able to pretend that everything fits when it doesn't. Your nervous system notices this long before your thoughts do. At this point, many people try to correct the feeling by forcing themselves back into old patterns. They double down on habits, relationships, or goals that once worked. They tell themselves they're just tired, distracted, ungrateful. But forcing alignment backward rarely works. It's like trying to tune an instrument by tightening a string that's already too tight. The sound doesn't improve, it just strains. There's also a subtle fear here that's easy to miss. Change in frequency threatens identity. If you no longer want what you used to want, who are you now? If you no longer enjoy the same conversations, where do you belong? Rather than sit with those questions, the mind often chooses familiarity over honesty, but the body doesn't cooperate. It responds with fatigue, restlessness, or a low-level sense of disconnection that won't go away. This is why out-of-alignment periods often feel confusing rather than dramatic. There may be no crisis, no clear external reason. From the outside, your life might look fine. From the inside, something feels slightly mistuned, like a radio station that almost comes in clearly, but never quite locks. That discomfort isn't asking for immediate answers. It's asking for attention. If you pause for a moment and observe how you move through a normal day, you might notice small signals, a hesitation before answering messages, a desire for more silence than usual, a tendency to withdraw from discussions that revolve around complaints, gossip, or repetition. These aren't flaws, they're data. They're showing you where your current energy no longer wants to go. Of course, there's a risk of misreading this moment. Not every discomfort means growth. Sometimes avoidance disguises itself as evolution. That's why it matters to check your motives gently. Are you pulling away because something feels shallow, or because it challenges you? Are you bored because you've outgrown something, or because you've stopped engaging fully? Honest observation matters more than quick conclusions. Still, when the feeling persists across different areas of life, it's usually not random. It's a sign that your inner system is recalibrating. Think of it like updating software while the device is still running. Some apps lag, some functions glitch. It doesn't mean the system is failing, it means it's in transition. What makes this phase particularly uncomfortable is that the new frequency isn't fully formed yet. You can feel what no longer fits, but you can't clearly see what's next. This in-between space can feel empty, even dull. Pleasure fades before meaning returns. And if you're not expecting this, it's easy to assume something has gone wrong. But nothing has gone wrong. You're not meant to rush this stage. Alignment isn't restored by adding more stimulation or more certainty. It returns when you allow your pace to slow enough for your awareness to catch up with the shift that's already underway. If you listen closely, you may notice that this misalignment isn't constant. It intensifies in certain environments and eases in others. Some places drain you quickly now. Some conversations leave you feeling foggy. Others, often unexpectedly, bring a quiet sense of relief. These fluctuations are clues. They're showing you where your current frequency is being supported and where it's being resisted. And here's where many people misunderstand what control looks like. When this process begins, it can feel like you're losing your grip on life. Old certainties loosen. Automatic reactions stop working. But this isn't loss of control, it's the end of autopilot. Awareness is stepping in where habit used to run the show. That shift can feel awkward, slower, less efficient. Yet it's also more real. And once you notice it, you can't fully go back to sleep. You may try, but something in you will keep signaling that the old rhythm no longer matches your internal tempo. This is also why trying to explain what you're feeling to others often falls flat. The change is internal, subtle, and still unfolding. Language lags behind experience. Some people will sense it and give you space without needing an explanation. Others will push you to return to how you were, not out of malice, but out of their own need for stability. All of this sets the stage for the next layer of the process, because as this frequency shift continues, it doesn't just affect what you enjoy or tolerate. It starts to change how you perceive progress itself, sometimes making growth feel like regression before anything new becomes visible. Before real change arrives, consciousness almost never announces itself loudly. There is no clear message, no dramatic event, no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. Instead, there is a quiet signal, so quiet that most people overlook it or explain it away or treat it as something temporary that will pass if ignored. But this signal is consistent. It appears again and again, gently at first, then with more insistence. The signal is a subtle loss of interest, not boredom in the obvious sense, and not depression either. It's more like the color drains out of things that once mattered to you. Activities you used to look forward to now feel flat. Achievements that once gave you a sense of direction barely register. You still show up, still perform, still participate, but something inside you is no longer fully there. It's as if your attention has loosened its grip. This is usually where people panic, even if they don't say it out loud. The mind starts searching for explanations. Maybe I'm unmotivated. Maybe I'm burned out. Maybe something is wrong with me. And because modern life is built around constant engagement, a drop in interest feels like a threat. We're taught that desire should always be strong, goals should always be clear, and energy should always be directed outward. But consciousness doesn't work like a machine that runs at a fixed speed. It moves in cycles. And one of the earliest signs that a cycle is ending is disengagement from what once defined you. This loss of interest isn't random, it's selective. You may notice that certain things still hold your attention, often simpler things. Silence, walking without headphones, watching how you react instead of reacting automatically. These moments don't excite you in the usual sense, but they feel strangely right, neutral, even calm. That contrast matters. What's happening is that your consciousness is withdrawing energy from old structures, old identities, old pursuits that have already taught you what they were meant to teach. This withdrawal feels like emptiness because something is being removed before anything new takes shape. Nature works this way all the time, but the mind resists it because it prefers continuity over truth. There's a temptation at this stage to fill the gap as quickly as possible, to chase new goals, new interests, new distractions, to scroll more, work more, consume more. Anything to avoid the discomfort of not knowing what you want. But filling the space too quickly often delays the very change that's trying to happen. The quiet signal isn't asking you to act yet. It's asking you to notice. Notice how forcing enthusiasm feels heavier than letting it fade. Notice how pretending to care costs more energy than admitting you don't. Notice how your body responds when you give yourself permission to not be interested for a moment without judgment. There's often a sense of relief there mixed with fear. Fear comes from the idea that if you let go, nothing will replace what's fading. But consciousness doesn't empty itself without purpose, it clears space. And space, while uncomfortable, is necessary for reorganization. This is also where many people misinterpret the signal as a personal failure. They compare themselves to who they used to be, or to others who seem driven and certain. They assume something has been lost rather than something being prepared. But motivation that disappears without an obvious external cause is rarely a defect. It's feedback. Another subtle aspect of this signal is a growing intolerance for noise, especially internal noise. You may find it harder to tolerate constant stimulation, shallow conversations, or repetitive thought loops. Things that once kept you busy now leave you feeling drained. This isn't sensitivity for its own sake. It's your system protecting the space it's trying to open. At the same time, doubt creeps in. You might wonder if you're becoming lazy, detached, or disconnected from life. This is where honesty is crucial. Ask yourself whether the loss of interest is making you numb or making you more aware. Numbness collapses perception. Awareness sharpens it, even when it's quiet. If you're paying attention, you'll notice that while interest in old things fades, curiosity begins to shift inward. You start questioning patterns you never questioned before. Why you react the way you do. Why certain choices feel automatic. Why certain paths were taken without reflection. This inward turn often happens before any outward change is visible. And because it's inward, it doesn't earn validation from the outside world. No one applauds inner reorientation. No metrics measure it, which is why it's so easy to dismiss. But this is the groundwork. Without it, any new direction would just be a rearrangement of the old. The silent signal can last longer than people expect. Weeks, months, sometimes longer. It doesn't follow a schedule. The mistake is trying to rush through it instead of listening to what it's withdrawing you from. Because every time you override it, every time you force yourself to stay interested in what no longer resonates, the signal returns a little stronger. Eventually, if ignored long enough, this quiet withdrawal turns into something louder. A sense of crisis, a feeling that everything has stalled. People often think the crisis is the beginning of the change, but it's usually the result of not listening earlier. Right now, the signal is still subtle. It's not asking you to burn bridges or make dramatic moves. It's simply loosening your attachment to what no longer aligns. And as that loosening continues, it can feel like you're losing ground, like your life is shrinking instead of expanding. That illusion sets up the next phase, where consciousness begins to strip away the familiar before anything new feels stable, making growth look suspiciously like going backward, even when it isn't. What you call a crisis is rarely what it appears to be on the surface. From the inside, it feels like collapse, like confusion, loss of direction, emotional instability, or a sudden inability to keep everything together the way you used to. But from the perspective of consciousness, this moment has a different name. It's not a breakdown, it's a reset. A reset doesn't feel gentle while it's happening. Systems don't reboot by asking permission. They interrupt. They pause what's running. They shut down processes that are no longer compatible. And when this happens in a human life, the mind reacts with alarm because it interprets interruption as danger. This is why the word crisis shows up so quickly. Crisis implies failure. It suggests something went wrong, something broke, something must be fixed immediately. And that urgency creates resistance. You try to restore the old order as fast as possible, even if that order was already unstable. But notice something important. Most personal crises don't arrive out of nowhere. They're preceded by signals you didn't fully honor. The loss of interest, the sense of misalignment, the quiet withdrawal of energy from things that once defined you. When those signals are ignored long enough, consciousness doesn't punish you. It intervenes. Intervention feels dramatic because it disrupts identity. Roles that once felt solid begin to wobble. Confidence becomes inconsistent. You might question decisions you've defended for years. From the outside, nothing catastrophic may have happened, yet internally everything feels up for review. This is where people often say, "I don't recognize myself anymore." That sentence sounds frightening, but it's deeply revealing. You're not meant to recognize the version of you that's being dismantled. Recognition belongs to the past. A reset is about making room for something that hasn't fully emerged yet. During this phase, the mind desperately looks for a single cause. A mistake, a bad choice, another person. Something to blame. Blame gives structure to chaos. It makes the experience feel manageable. But resets aren't caused by one event. They're caused by accumulated misalignment, finally reaching a threshold. The emotional texture of a reset is confusing because it's mixed. There can be anxiety and relief at the same time, grief and clarity, a sense of losing ground paired with a strange lightness. These contradictions are a clue that you're not simply falling apart, you're being reorganized. Another important detail is that resets often slow you down against your will. Productivity drops. Motivation becomes unpredictable. The old methods of pushing through stop working. This feels threatening in a culture that equates forward motion with worth. But slowness here isn't regression. It's recalibration. Think about how the body heals. It doesn't do it while running at full speed. It redirects energy inward. Externally, it looks like weakness. Internally, it's intelligence. Consciousness follows the same principle. When it needs to update its structure, it pulls resources away from performance and redirects them toward integration. This is also why advice from well-meaning people can feel useless during this time. Just stay positive. Just set new goals. Just be grateful. Those suggestions assume the old framework still applies, but a reset happens when the framework itself is being questioned. Applying old solutions only adds friction. There's also a deeper fear beneath the surface of a reset. The fear that if you let this process unfold, you might lose things permanently. Status, relationships, certainty. And sometimes that fear isn't entirely wrong. Some things don't survive a reset. But what leaves is usually what was held together by effort rather than truth. This doesn't mean destruction for the sake of destruction. Consciousness is efficient. It removes what no longer supports coherence, what no longer matches your internal frequency. The pain comes from attachment, not from the removal itself. One of the most disorienting parts of a reset is that progress becomes invisible. You may feel like nothing is improving, even as something fundamental is shifting. There are fewer external markers, less feedback, more waiting. This is where the mind starts narrating failure. But if you look closely, subtle changes are happening. Your reactions slow down. Your tolerance for false urgency decreases. You become more selective with where your energy goes, even if you don't yet know where it should go instead. These are not signs of collapse. They're signs of system integrity being restored. A reset doesn't ask you to understand everything. It asks you to stop fighting the pause, to stop demanding immediate clarity, to allow uncertainty to exist without turning it into a story about what's wrong with you. And this is where many people get stuck, because uncertainty feels like loss of control. Yet the old sense of control was often just habit wearing the mask of confidence. As that mask dissolves, it can feel like you're regressing, like you're less capable than before. That illusion becomes stronger right before the next shift, when consciousness begins to remove external structures you leaned on, making it seem as if you're going backward, when in reality, the ground is being cleared for something more stable to take root. Your current environment may be draining you energetically in ways that are so subtle you've learned to normalize them. Not because the environment is bad in itself, but because it no longer matches who you are becoming. What once felt neutral now feels heavy. What once felt familiar now feels loud. And because the change happened inside you first, the mismatch shows up as exhaustion rather than clarity. Energy drain isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always look like stress or conflict. Often it shows up as a quiet tiredness that doesn't go away with rest. You sleep, but you don't feel restored. You take breaks, but nothing really resets. This happens when your system is constantly adapting to surroundings that require you to compress, explain, or dull parts of yourself just to function. At earlier stages of life, we adapt easily. We learn the rules of places, relationships, routines, and we shape ourselves to fit them. That flexibility is useful. But there comes a point when adaptation starts costing more energy than it gives back. You're no longer learning from the environment, you're surviving it. And survival mode, even a mild version of it, is expensive. You may notice this drain most clearly after certain interactions, not because anything overtly negative happened, but because you had to maintain a version of yourself that no longer feels natural. You filtered your thoughts, you managed your reactions, you stayed engaged in conversations that moved in circles you've already outgrown. By the time it's over, you feel oddly empty. Places can do the same thing. A room, a workplace, a daily route that once felt fine can suddenly feel constricting. The noise level, the pace, the expectations embedded in that space start to press against you. You might not consciously think, "This is wrong for me," but your body registers it. Your shoulders tighten, your breath shortens, your patience thins. This doesn't mean you should immediately leave everything behind. Awareness comes before action. What matters first is recognizing that energy isn't just physical, it's relational, it's contextual, it's shaped by what you're exposed to repeatedly. When your consciousness shifts, your sensitivity to these exposures increases. Earlier, you could tolerate environments that were misaligned because you were running on momentum. Now that momentum has slowed, the autopilot has disengaged. And without it, every mismatch becomes more noticeable. That's not weakness, that's precision. One common misunderstanding is assuming that if something drains you, it must be objectively toxic. That's not always true. Sometimes the environment is simply calibrated to an earlier version of you. It still works for who you were, not for who you are now. Staying doesn't make you loyal or strong. It just keeps you tired. There's also a subtle guilt that can arise here. You might think, "I should be able to handle this," or "nothing is actually wrong." And you're right in a narrow sense, nothing is broken. But alignment isn't about whether you can endure something. It's about whether enduring it is still necessary. Pay attention to how much recovery time you need after being in certain settings. Not dramatic recovery, just the quiet urge to be alone, to be silent, to reset your nervous system. That need is information. It's telling you where energy is being lost faster than it's being replenished. Another sign of environmental drain is how difficult it becomes to access your natural curiosity or creativity. When you're in the right conditions, insight arises spontaneously. You don't have to force it. When the environment is wrong, even simple thinking feels like effort. Ideas dry up. Everything feels mechanical. This is especially confusing because you might still be competent there. You still perform well. Others may even praise you. But inside, the cost keeps rising, and competence can hide misalignment for a long time until it can't. As your consciousness continues to reorganize, it seeks coherence. It wants fewer internal contradictions. Environments that require you to split yourself into parts become harder to tolerate. You start noticing how often you override your instincts just to keep things running smoothly. That noticing can feel uncomfortable. It can make you restless. You may start questioning routines you never questioned before. Why you say yes when you mean no. Why you stay engaged when your energy has already left the room. These questions don't demand immediate answers, but they change how you experience your surroundings. What's important here is not to label everything as draining all at once. That's another form of escape. The task is simpler and harder at the same time, to observe honestly how different environments affect your state. Not how they look, not how they should feel, how they actually feel in your body over time. You may find that even small adjustments bring noticeable relief. A different pace in the morning, fewer overlapping inputs, more intentional pauses between engagements. These aren't solutions yet. They're signals that your system is learning what supports it now. And as this awareness sharpens, something else begins to happen. You realize that the drain isn't just external. It's also coming from habits of attention you've carried with you, ways of responding automatically, ways of staying busy to avoid listening too closely. That realization sets the stage for the next shift, when it becomes clear that you're not losing control at all, but slowly stepping out of autopilot into a more deliberate relationship with where your energy goes and why. It can feel unsettling when the structures that once guided you stop working. Decisions that used to be automatic now require thought. Reactions that once came instantly now pause halfway. You might catch yourself hesitating where you never did before, questioning choices that once felt obvious. And the mind quickly labels this as losing control. But this isn't loss, it's interruption. You're not falling apart. You're stepping out of autopilot. Autopilot is efficient. It runs on patterns, habits, learned responses. It keeps life moving without asking many questions. For a long time, it serves a purpose. It helps you function, succeed, belong. But autopilot doesn't adapt well when your inner values change. It keeps repeating what once worked, even when it no longer fits. When consciousness begins to expand, autopilot starts to glitch. Old triggers don't produce the same reactions. Old motivations don't push you the same way. The mind experiences this as instability because it prefers predictability. Yet what's really happening is that awareness is replacing automation. This shift feels uncomfortable because awareness is slower. It doesn't rush to conclusions. It notices nuance. It asks, is this still true for me? And in a world that rewards speed and certainty, that pause can feel like weakness. You may notice this most in moments where you used to react without thinking. Someone says something that would normally pull you into agreement, defense, or justification. Instead, there's a gap. Not silence exactly, but space. And in that space, you realize you're no longer sure how you feel. That uncertainty isn't confusion, it's choice entering the picture. Leaving autopilot means you can no longer hide behind reflex. You start to see how often you've been saying yes out of habit, how often you've been busy to avoid listening, how often you've been chasing momentum instead of meaning. This realization can feel destabilizing because it exposes how much of your life was running itself. There's also a strange fatigue that comes with this phase. Not because you're doing more, but because you're noticing more. Awareness consumes energy at first. Every choice feels heavier because it's no longer automatic. You're learning to steer instead of coast, and that requires attention muscles you haven't used in a while. This is where people often long for the old version of control. The version where you knew exactly what to do next, where your calendar was full and your direction felt clear. But that control was built on repetition, not presence. It worked as long as your inner landscape stayed the same. Now that something inside you has shifted, control has to be redefined. It's no longer about managing outcomes, it's about managing attention. Where you place it, what you respond to, what you let pass without engagement. That transition can feel like vulnerability. You may worry that without autopilot, you'll make mistakes, disappoint people, or lose your edge. And yes, you might move slower. You might change your mind more often. But slowness here isn't incompetence. It's calibration. Think of how careful you become when driving a road you don't know well. You pay attention to signs, curves, and conditions. You don't speed. You don't assume. That attentiveness isn't fear. It's respect for unfamiliar terrain. Leaving autopilot is like entering a new internal landscape. It makes sense that you'd slow down. Another unsettling part of this phase is realizing how much of your identity was tied to being certain, to having answers, to being the one who knew what to do. As that identity loosens, you may feel exposed, less defined, but definition based on awareness is more flexible than definition based on habit. You might also notice that your tolerance for forcing outcomes decreases. Pushing yourself through situations that don't feel right becomes harder. Not because you can't, but because something in you resists unnecessary effort. This resistance is often misunderstood as lack of discipline. In reality, it's discernment starting to form. Autopilot thrives on should. Awareness listens for is. That shift changes how you experience responsibility. You still care. You still show up. But you're less willing to override your internal signals just to maintain appearances. And that can create friction, both internally and with others. From the outside, it may look like you're becoming inconsistent, less predictable, less easy to read. But internally, there's often a growing sense of honesty. You're less split, less divided between what you feel and what you do. That coherence takes time to stabilize. This is also why you may struggle to explain what's happening to you. Autopilot is easy to justify. Awareness is harder to package into words. I don't know yet becomes a more frequent answer. And for people who rely on certainty, that can be uncomfortable. Not everyone will understand this shift. Some may interpret your pauses as hesitation, your boundaries as withdrawal, your questioning as doubt. But understanding isn't required for the process to continue. Consciousness doesn't wait for consensus. As you move further out of autopilot, it becomes clear that control was never about gripping life tightly. It was about moving unconsciously in familiar grooves. Now those grooves no longer guide you, and that's why the next phase often brings a sense of social distance, as you realize that not everyone is moving at the same depth or pace, and that this too is part of the realignment. Not everyone will understand what you're feeling, and that can be one of the most painful parts of this phase. Not because you need approval, but because human beings are wired to seek resonance. We want to feel met, reflected, understood. And when something fundamental is shifting inside you, the lack of recognition can feel like isolation, even when you're surrounded by people. You may try to explain what's happening and find that the words fall flat. You say you feel different, but not bad. That things don't fit the way they used to, but nothing specific is wrong. You talk about needing space, slowing down, questioning things. And you can see it in their faces: confusion, concern, impatience. They want a clear reason, a label, a fix. But what you're experiencing doesn't fit neatly into language yet. It's internal, ongoing, still forming. And most people can only understand change when it looks like something they've already experienced or categorized. If your process doesn't match their reference points, they unconsciously dismiss it or try to correct it. This is where the loneliness often appears. Not because you're alone, but because you're no longer mirrored in the same way. Conversations that once felt connecting now feel shallow or misaligned. You notice yourself holding back, not out of secrecy, but out of fatigue. Explaining yourself starts to feel like another form of effort. It's important to understand that this gap isn't caused by anyone doing something wrong. It's caused by differences in timing and depth. Consciousness doesn't expand in groups at the same pace. Some people are still operating comfortably on autopilot. Others are in different stages of questioning. Expecting everyone to understand where you are would be like expecting people in different seasons to feel the same weather. Often, the people who struggle most to understand your shift are the ones who benefited from you staying the same. Not because they're selfish, but because stability feels safe. Your change introduces uncertainty into their world. It forces them, even subtly, to question their own patterns, and not everyone is ready for that. You might notice subtle resistance, jokes that minimize what you're feeling, advice that pushes you back toward your old self. Comments like, "You're overthinking," or "Just relax, it'll pass." These responses aren't malicious, they're protective. They protect the familiar. At the same time, there may be people you expected to understand who don't. That can hurt more than outright dismissal. You shared history, values, experiences. You assumed they would see you. When they don't, it can feel like a quiet loss. But shared past doesn't guarantee shared direction. This is where discernment becomes essential. Not everyone needs to understand you, and not everyone deserves full access to your inner process. Awareness teaches selectivity, not withdrawal. You begin to sense who can listen without trying to fix you, who can be present without demanding clarity. You may also find that new connections start appearing in unexpected ways. Brief conversations that feel oddly real, people who don't know your past but resonate with your present. These moments aren't accidents. They're signs that your internal shift is changing what you attune to. Still, even with these glimpses of resonance, there's often a stretch where understanding feels scarce. This can trigger self-doubt. You might wonder if you're imagining things, if you're being dramatic, if you should just go back to how you were. This is a critical moment. Ask yourself gently, does returning feel honest or just familiar? There's a difference. Familiarity soothes anxiety, but honesty stabilizes the system. One quiet check-in with yourself can reveal which one you're reaching for. Another layer of this experience is realizing that being understood used to be part of your identity. Maybe you were the one who explained things well, who connected easily, who fit into many spaces. As that ability shifts, it can feel like you're losing social ground. But what's actually changing is your tolerance for being misunderstood in order to belong. There's a subtle strength forming here. the ability to stay with your experience even when it isn't validated. Not in a defiant way, but in a grounded one. You stop needing constant agreement to trust yourself. That doesn't make you closed, it makes you rooted. Of course, this doesn't mean cutting people off or retreating into isolation. It means allowing relationships to adjust naturally. Some will deepen, some will soften, some will fade. This isn't a failure of connection, it's a reconfiguration of it. And as this happens, you may notice something unexpected. The less you try to be understood, the more clearly you begin to understand yourself. Without the pressure to explain, your inner dialogue becomes quieter, more precise. You start listening to signals you used to override in order to keep harmony. That inner clarity doesn't come with immediate confidence. Often it comes with humility. You realize how much you don't know yet, how much is still unfolding. This can look like uncertainty from the outside, but inside it feels like preparation. Because the truth is, this phase isn't just about others not understanding you. It's about you no longer fully understanding yourself in the old way. And that can feel like regression, like you're becoming less capable or less defined, right before something more stable begins to take shape beneath the surface. There is a stage of consciousness expansion that almost everyone misunderstands when they pass through it. From the inside, it feels like regression, like you're losing ground instead of gaining it. Skills you relied on feel dull, confidence wavers, your sense of direction blurs. You look at yourself and wonder how you became less clear, less decisive, less effective than before. But this stage isn't backward movement, it's preparation. What makes it feel like regression is the collapse of borrowed structures. Ways of thinking, coping, and performing that once supported you are no longer being reinforced. You're not failing at them, you're being released from them. And release always feels like loss before it feels like freedom. In earlier phases of life, growth is visible. You learn something, apply it, get results, there's feedback, progress feels linear. This stage doesn't work that way. The growth is subterranean. It's happening beneath behavior, beneath personality, beneath roles. And because you can't point to clear improvements, the mind assumes something has gone wrong. This is especially confusing if you've been competent, capable, or high-functioning. You're used to moving forward by effort. When effort stops producing the same outcomes, you interpret it as decline. But effort isn't the problem. It's no longer the solution. During this phase, you may feel simpler in ways that worry you. Less articulate, less driven, less certain. You may catch yourself struggling to articulate thoughts that once came easily. Not because your mind is weakening, but because it's reorganizing. Old language doesn't quite fit the new awareness forming underneath. Think of it like renovating a house while still living in it. Rooms become inaccessible, hallways are blocked, nothing looks finished. From the outside, it appears chaotic, but the chaos has intention, it's directed, and most importantly, it's temporary. One of the hardest parts of this stage is the emotional vulnerability it brings. Without your usual strengths operating at full capacity, you may feel exposed. You might doubt your value. You might compare yourself to who you were and feel disappointed. That comparison is natural, but it's misleading. You're comparing a completed structure to one that's mid-renovation. There's also a strong temptation to rebuild the old version of yourself, to regain your previous confidence, productivity, or certainty at any cost. But rebuilding too quickly often means reconstructing the same limitations. Consciousness resists that. It withholds the old fuel so something deeper can form. This phase often brings a sense of humility. You realize how much of what you thought was you was actually adaptation, performance, survival strategies refined over time. As those fall away, there's a quiet question that surfaces. Who are you without all that? That question can feel unsettling, even frightening. There's no immediate answer, and that's the point. Identity is loosening, so it can be reassembled with more integrity, with less contradiction between what you feel and what you live. You may notice that external validation matters less now, even as internal uncertainty grows. Praise doesn't land the way it used to. Criticism stings differently. Both feel slightly irrelevant. This can be confusing. Validation once helped you orient yourself. Now it feels distant, almost hollow. At the same time, you may feel more sensitive to internal signals. Your body speaks louder, your reactions slow. You become more aware of when something is misaligned, even if you don't know what alignment looks like yet. That sensitivity is not fragility, it's refinement. The regression illusion is strongest when you measure yourself by old metrics: speed, output, certainty, control. Those metrics don't apply here. They belong to a different stage. Judging yourself by them will only deepen the sense of failure. Instead, notice what is quietly improving: your ability to pause, your tolerance for not knowing, your willingness to sit with discomfort without immediately fixing it. These aren't glamorous skills, they don't impress anyone, but they form the foundation for a more stable, less reactive way of being. This stage also tests your patience. Consciousness doesn't rush integration. It waits until the ground is solid, and because nothing dramatic is happening on the surface, impatience turns inward as self-criticism. You might think you're wasting time, falling behind, missing something. But preparation rarely looks productive. Seeds don't look busy underground, yet everything depends on that unseen work. You may also notice that your desire to seek external answers intensifies here. Books, methods, techniques, explanations, anything to escape the uncertainty. And while some guidance can be helpful, there's a growing sense that no external framework fully captures what you're experiencing. That realization points to the next shift, because as this preparatory phase deepens, the search for answers outside begins to feel less satisfying, less reliable. Something in you starts turning inward, not out of avoidance, but out of necessity, sensing that the most important guidance now has to come from a quieter, more internal place. The greatest spiritual trap is subtle, and that's why so many intelligent, sincere people fall into it without noticing. It looks like growth. It sounds like responsibility. It even feels active and hopeful at first. The trap is believing that the answers you need are somewhere outside you, when the change that's happening is already inside. When things start shifting internally, the instinctive response is to search, to read more, learn more, ask more questions. Find the right framework, the right teacher, the right explanation that will finally make everything click. This impulse isn't wrong. It comes from a genuine desire to understand. But there's a point where seeking stops being supportive and starts becoming a way to avoid listening. At earlier stages, external guidance is useful. It gives language to experience. It offers perspective. It helps you recognize patterns. But when consciousness reaches a certain depth, the same tools begin to lose their effectiveness, not because they're false, but because they're no longer precise enough for what you're living. You may notice this as a strange dissatisfaction. You consume insights that once felt powerful, but now they barely register. You nod along, understand the words, yet nothing changes inside. Or you feel briefly inspired, only to return to the same inner fog hours later. This isn't because you haven't found the right source yet. It's because you're asking the wrong direction. The trap deepens when seeking becomes compulsive. One more video, one more book, one more method. Each promises clarity, but instead of grounding you, they scatter your attention. You start layering interpretations on top of raw experience until you're more informed but less present. This happens because the change underway isn't conceptual, it's structural. Your consciousness is reorganizing how it processes reality, not just what it believes about it. No external answer can substitute for that internal shift. At best, outside input can point. It cannot walk the terrain for you. There's also a subtle form of self-distrust hidden in constant seeking. An unspoken assumption that whatever is happening inside you can't be trusted unless it's confirmed by someone else. That assumption may have been useful once. It kept you grounded. But now it quietly undermines the very intelligence that's trying to emerge. You might notice resistance to silence during this phase. Moments with no input feel uncomfortable, empty, even boring. That discomfort often sends people reaching for guidance again. But silence isn't empty here. It's unfamiliar. It lacks the structure you're used to leaning on. Inside that silence, signals are quieter but more accurate. Sensations instead of explanations. Subtle clarity instead of dramatic insight. A sense of rightness or wrongness that doesn't argue its case. These signals don't compete well with polished ideas from the outside. They don't sell themselves. They require patience. Another part of the trap is mistaking complexity for depth. When inner change stalls, the mind often seeks more sophisticated theories, hoping complexity will unlock progress. But complexity often delays integration. It gives the mind something to do, while the deeper layers wait to be acknowledged. You may also notice that seeking outside keeps you slightly ahead of yourself. You're always preparing for a future understanding, rather than inhabiting the one that's already unfolding. That forward lean creates tension, a sense that you're almost there but not quite. And almost can last indefinitely. This doesn't mean abandoning learning or guidance altogether. It means changing your relationship with them. Instead of asking, "What does this say?" the question becomes, "What does this stir in me?" Instead of collecting answers, you begin testing resonance. Does this settle your system or agitate it? Does it clarify or distract? There's often fear underneath the reluctance to turn inward. Fear that nothing will be there. Fear that the answers will be inconvenient. Fear that listening deeply will require change you can't yet imagine. Seeking outside keeps those fears at a safe distance, but the longer you avoid that inward turn, the more restless the seeking becomes. No answer satisfies, no explanation lands, and eventually exhaustion sets in. That exhaustion isn't failure. It's a signal that the strategy has run its course. When you stop searching long enough to listen, you may be surprised by how much is already present. Not as conclusions, but as direction. A quiet pull away from certain things, a steady draw toward others, a sense of timing that doesn't match urgency but feels right nonetheless. This inner guidance doesn't shout, it doesn't persuade, it doesn't provide guarantees. That's why it's easy to dismiss. But it has one quality external answers lack at this stage: coherence. When you follow it, even tentatively, there's less internal friction, less self-contradiction. Letting go of the need for external answers can feel like stepping into uncertainty without a map. And in a way it is, but maps are only useful for territories that are already charted. What you're moving through now is being discovered from the inside. As this shift continues, something else becomes clear. The problem was never that you didn't know enough. It was that you were listening outward while the real conversation was happening within. And as that internal dialogue grows stronger, the desire to seek externally doesn't disappear overnight, but it slowly loses its grip, making room for a quieter, more grounded form of knowing to take the lead. What's happening to you is not a mistake. It's not a failure, a weakness, or something you need to fix. It's the purest form of awakening. An awakening doesn't arrive with clear answers or perfect confidence. It arrives by removing what no longer fits, by slowing you down, by asking you to listen more deeply than you ever have before. You're not broken. You're becoming more honest with yourself. And that honesty can feel lonely, disorienting, even frightening at times, but it's also the moment when your life stops being driven only by habit and starts being guided by awareness. There may be no map, no clear timeline, and no external validation. And yet something in you knows this matters. If you felt seen by these words, if something inside you quietly said, "Yes, this is exactly it," then you're already paying attention. Before you go, write this sentence in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. I trust the process. And if this resonated with you and you want to go deeper, choose one of the videos appearing on the screen now. It was made for this exact moment.